We must look forward 100, 200, 300 years to the time when the vast continent of Australia will contain an enormous population. And when that great population will look back through the preceding periods of time to the world-shaking episode of the Great War. And when they will seek out, with the most intense care, every detail of that struggle, when the movements of every battalion, of every company, will be elaborately unfolded to the gaze of all. When every family will seek to trace some connection with the heroes who landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, or fought on the Somme, or in the other great battles in France.
In the years after World War I, honour boards became the norm in churches, school halls and community venues. The soldier with the inverted rifle atop a memorial became another familiar sight in most towns and cities across our nation. The names of the men and women who went to war all listed. No rank usually. Some listed the decoration the individual received, but the most poignant symbol was the letter K, killed. Behind that one letter was a grieving family. Spouse, parent, brother, sister, child. A very small minority of those families would ever grieve at their loved one's graveside. Gallipoli, Northern Africa, or the Western Front in Europe, too far away for Australian families. Our story starts to some extent here. I'm at the RSL in Ipswich, and this is one of the honour boards behind me that's taken from the Brassel Methodist Church. For King and Country at the top, 24 names, and a K beside 5 of those names. And in the second column, 2 brothers, Frederick Charles Litzow, and his younger brother, August Robert Litzow, known as Robert. In speaking to the family, no one's really sure why the names appear on this particular honour board at the Brassel Methodist Church. The Litzow family were traditionally Baptist, but we do know the family attended the main Anglican church, St Paul's, in the centre of the city. Who were these 2 brothers? Where did they come from? Where did they serve? This is their story. The story of 2 brothers in France. Fred was the older of the 2 brothers, born in Lowood, 2 years apart. They had one other brother and 4 sisters. Both of them were educated at Tarampa State School. Fred, after leaving school, was a carter, and Robert, a labourer. The war had now been raging for about 2.5 years, and it was 1917, and Fred, nearly 24, Robert, almost 22, both wanted to join up. However, there was a problem. Well, in fact, there was a couple of problems. The boys had German ancestry. Fred Sr., the boys' dad, and Mary, their mum, both their fathers were German. The parents, they could speak German, and in fact, so could the boys. And they could write German as well. And if there was ever a time when men with German backgrounds would be able to enlist, it was perhaps now. You see, 1916 was a brutal year for the Allies in Western Europe, and certainly the Australians had suffered, well, horrific casualties. The Battle of the Somme, Fromelles, Pozieres, just to name a few of those battles, had left many of the Australian battalions severely undermanned and really under strength. Prime Minister Billy Hughes had lost an October 1916 conscription vote, so the army was desperate for men. So in January 1917, they took the plunge, both of them deciding now was the time. Letters to be written. Well, 2 letters in fact, by both brothers. Both letters the same, and both to the commanding officer at what is now Gallipoli Barracks. It's clear when you read the letter, the boys could not have composed it. The language, The Frasers were simply not them.
I believe that I have never, at any time, heard my father or mother say a single word antagonistic to the British or British flag, and I believe both of them to be thoroughly loyal to the British throne, and I have heard my father say more than once that he wished he could enlist and fight for the Allies, but was prevented by age and ill health.
A couple of days later, Fred and Robert Litzow take the oath of enlistment. The two boys from Brassel are to go to war, and one of them will not come back. The boys commence their training, and the brutal heat of a Brisbane summer would be in stark contrast to those freezing winter conditions that they would experience in France. The two boys are appointed to the 12th Reinforcements, 12 Machine Gun Company, and after travelling from Brisbane to Melbourne, they depart Melbourne on the 21st of June 1917, embarking the HMAT Suvac, bound for Liverpool. Arriving 2 months later on the 28th of August 1917, these two Ipswich boys in the UK, winter about to hit. One can only imagine the sights and sounds of the famous Liverpool dock area, what that would have been like to them. Then, straight to their new home for the next 3 months. Number 11 camp, Salisbury Plain. What a sight greeted the boys from Australia. Trenches replicated the trenches on the Western Front. The training was very specific. Hard and yelling NCOs was the norm. To get offside with these men was to be avoided at all cost, and Fred managed to get into some trouble. Failing to perform fatigue duties was the charge, 21 days detention. Unusually harsh for the time was his penalty. Trench warfare and all that entailed, from hand-to-hand fighting to how to use the bayonet, how to use the Lewis machine gun, to its maximum effect, was day in, day out. Then, finally in November 1917, after months of training, reveille sounded at 4:30 a.m. The men packed everything they could in their pack, 45 kilograms of weight. Final inspection, and then the 4.5 kilometre march to Amesbury Station. Each soldier now bearing the new dark blue over light blue colour patch of the 42nd Battalion, their new battalion. Yield to none, their motto, known as the Australian Black Watch, the same as the 42nd Scottish Highland Regiment, the sounds of the pipes played by the battalion band helping them make the journey. What were the emotions of these two brothers? What were they thinking? The excitement of these two boys from Ipswich. I wonder as they looked around at their mates, did they think who would come back? What lay ahead? I'm sure they'd heard of the recent Battle of Passendale, where 38,000 Australians were killed or wounded, and they were the replacements of the extremely depleted Australian battalions. Little did they know, the war was still in the balance as 1917 drew to a close.
Dear Mum, just a few lines to let you know that I'm still well. Hoping you are all the same at home. I'm still in Godford, but I'm expected to get to France any day. Dear Mum, I shouldn't worry so much if God wills it. I'll return to you all again. I can only trust him, and I'll hope he'll see me through. It's very cold here at present, and we'll just get to France in the middle of winter. With love to all at home, from your loving son, Fred.
Arriving in France in early December 1917, the bitter winter cold would have been a shock to the Litzow boys. However, traditionally there was not much fighting done in those cold months, and Passendale had ensured a lull in hostilities simply due to the huge losses on both sides. The records of the 42nd Battalion indicate there was little if any fighting at this time, and that was good. So Christmas Day came and the 42nd found themselves at the front. So Christmas dinner was postponed until the 30th of December, and then they were rotated back to the reserve area. Now, in the reserve area, drill competitions still went on, weapons training, but it wouldn't be long before the front line trenches beckoned again. Rumours of a massive German offensive were everywhere. In fact, rumours were nothing new, but the men believed this one. And on the 5th of February, back to the front trenches. Yet apart from some constant patrolling, it was still pretty quiet. And there's no record of really anything taking place for the 42nd Battalion during this time. Yet on the 18th of February, 1918, while the battalion is still in the front line, Robert is wounded in action. Now, how was he wounded? What was the injury? The writing is particularly difficult to interpret in Robert's service record. So what do we know of this incident? Well, there was no battle, there was no trench raid, couldn't have been a sniper or a shrapnel pellet or a shell fragment. Again, we just don't know. And later, it confusingly says in his record that it was an accidental wounding. Now, believe me, they were not uncommon. So Robert is taken with this gunshot wound to the left elbow to the 2nd Australian Casualty Station and then transferred to England on the 11th of March 1918. He doesn't return to the battalion until late July, so we know this wound is particularly serious. Can you imagine the Litzow home in Brassel when this communication arrived?
Dear Sir, I regret to advise you that Private R.A. Litzow has been reported wounded. In the absence of further reports, it is to be assumed that satisfactory progress is being maintained, but anything later received will be promptly transmitted, it being clearly understood that if no further advice is forwarded, this department has no more information to supply. Signed, Major J.M. Lane.
On the 21st of March 1918, the Germans launched a massive offensive. This was their last throw of the dice, and they attacked the front line of a really tired and weary British Fifth Army in the area of the Somme. German troops released from the Russian front boosted the number, and the tactics that the Germans employed had been attempted on a small scale, but now they unleashed them on a larger scale. Stormtroopers, highly trained troops, sought out weak spots in the Allied line and then created as much havoc as possible, taking out Allied headquarters, communications, and if possible, their artillery. In this offensive, there was a huge artillery bombardment of over 1,160,000 shells, including gas, across 65 kilometres of front, 74 German divisions. Mopping up was not a luxury the Germans had, as the tactics were to take as much ground as possible and force the Allied lines back. The offensive, codenamed Operation Michael, was fierce and turned into a planned 5 smaller offensive, all aimed at pushing the Allies all the way back to those coastal ports. At first, the actual offensive worked. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, the British are pushed back. The 3rd Division, of which Fred Lithgow's 42nd Battalion are part, are rushed into action to help stop the offensive. Now, what would Fred be thinking as his battalion is headed to the front? Firstly in trains, then motor truck transports, and then on foot. And the scene he would have witnessed was of total and utter confusion. Eyewitness reports tell of the retreating troops of the British Fifth Army bedraggled, many wounded, and many not even exchanging words with the Aussie troops. French civilian refugees clogging the roads, making the move forward so much more difficult. Some cried out, "Vive l'Australian!" but the majority simply had this look of hopeless despair. Could there have been a more pitiful sight? Now, the Germans had now reached Villers-Bretonneux. This was one of their objectives. And from there, if they could capture the railhead, then they could get the rail line to Paris.
By capturing the railhead at Villers-Bretonneux and nearby Amiens, that gives the German army capacity to shift vast volumes of men and material to the capital. And during the war, there's still this sense that capturing the capital wins you the war.
The Germans had to be stopped. The 42nd Battalion crosses the Anchor River and takes up a 2,000 metre front. The fighting is incredibly ferocious. On the 1st of April, the 42nd came out of the line for a really well-owned spell. The German offensive had stalled, at least for the time being in this area. However, it was definitely not over yet. Fred returns to the old trenches on the 19th of April, and everyone knew, that the Germans were planning something. They were not finished yet.
What's particularly interesting about the German approach here is it's not at all like the Allies. The Germans are using manpower and they want to break the lines. So they are throwing everything they've got into just a small spearhead and pushing the lines back. And so the whole situation is desperate and urgent and really scary for the armies that are trying to stop this German onslaught.
On the 24th of April, the men of Fred's battalion, desperately in need of some type of shower or bath, moved to the village of Bonnet. No sooner had they arrived, the Germans attacked. The Australians, including Fred, take up a defensive position on the Anchor River, possibly near the village of Corby. Now, what came next was to be expected. A huge barrage of enemy shells. Frederick Charles Litzow, the young man from Ipswich, is killed. Across the planet, in their Brassel home, Fred Sr. and Mary Litzow have no idea of what has just happened. Usually, upon the death of a soldier, the method of telling the family is the same. The local minister is given the job, a role that, reading some of the minister's journals, they have come to really hate. Yet it seems Ipswich is slightly different. We know that the mayor of the city at that time, Mr. Frank Barker, who had a heart for the soldiers and their families, often delivered the news himself, and so he did to the Litzow home. One can only imagine the grief in the Litzow home. The news would have travelled quickly through that small suburb of Brassel. Perhaps the local priest came around, the neighbours and the relatives, they would have visited as well, some with food and others just to offer comfort. How did Fred die? Well, this must have been the question on the family's lips. So Mary Litzow writes to the army on the 6th of May.
Sir, I beg to draw your attention that I have been notified by the Defence Department through the Mayor of Ipswich that my son Frederick was killed in action. I shall be grateful to you if you would kindly advise me, should it lay in your power, how my son got killed in action. I am yours truly, Mrs. Mary Litzow.
Little did Mary know that a letter was already on its way to her from Lieutenant H.B. Horsburgh, dated the same day as her letter, written from somewhere in France. It's headed, date 6th of May, to Mrs. F.W. Litzow of Brassel.
It is with feelings of deepest sympathy that I write to you of the death of your son, Private Frederick. He was killed in action on the 24th of April 1918 by a piece of shell which burst only a few yards from him. He was buried on the left bank of the Anchor River. His grave will be registered and the full particulars of the exact spot furnished to you when the severe fighting is over. As company commander, I wish to extend to yourself and family the deepest sympathy of the whole of the company, by whom he was well known and greatly respected.
When I look at the photo of Fred, he just looks so young. Now, I obviously didn't know him, yet now I feel I do. He was part of a generation that lost, according to historian Les Carline, many of its most generous male spirits. Fred was only one of a generation of young Australians killed. More than half, again according to Carline, probably died from the way Fred did, from artillery fire. Fred was one of 12 Australian soldiers killed that day. 35 were wounded. The fighting, as the lieutenant says, was severe. Sometime later, Fred's personal possessions arrive home. Photos, perhaps of family. Letters, again, perhaps from family. A wallet, coins, a religious book. Robert arrived back in France on the 24th of July and rejoins his unit on the 4th of August. It is doubtful that he had seen much action since joining the 42nd Battalion the previous December. However, this was about to dramatically change.
From the 8th of April onwards, the Australians are constantly fighting, constantly pushing on, taking trench after village after trench after small hill after town.
General John Monash was placed in charge of the entire Australian Army and had proven in the Battle of Hamil that a careful, strategic, fully considered and meticulously planned battle plan could achieve results. To some extent, emboldened by that success, the Allied commanders pushed for a huge counter-offensive against the Germans. And this offensive would be known as the Battle of Amiens. Soldiers recall the morning of the 8th of August. As such heavy mist came in, one couldn't even see 10 metres in front of you. Then at 4:19 a.m, 1 minute before it was supposed to, according to Charles Bean, the Australian historian, an almighty barrage commenced. The earth actually shook as the Australians advanced behind the creeping barrage. Robert's 42nd Battalion performed incredibly well. 300 prisoners captured, 3 77-inch guns, 25 machine guns, 7 trench mortars, and heaps of ammunition, not to mention souvenirs, which the Australians were experts at obtaining. The next day, Robert and the battalion rested, ready for action again, as the 12th of August would be a day that Robert would never forget. The men of the 42nd, recalling some years later, would call the 12th of August the Daylight Stunt. Monash wanted ground taken. He wants the Australians to keep moving. The pressure is on. Now, when that happens, sometimes there are pockets of the enemies that are not quite mopped up. Robert and the 42nd Battalion, alongside some platoons from the 44th, attack in broad daylight. The fighting is absolutely ferocious. The Germans throw everything at the Australians. Machine guns, anti-tank fire, and heavy rifle fire. Robert, he's with Sergeant, later Lieutenant George Forster, and 2 other soldiers. All 4, on numerous occasions, run into no man's land and rescue wounded men. Now, it's possible that Robert was acting as a stretcher bearer on that day, but he and the other men are recommended for the military medal. The recommendation says that he displayed great courage and coolness under trying circumstances. The recommendation is endorsed by Brigadier General James Cannon. The recommendation goes up to the headquarters of General Monash, but no medal is awarded to any of the men for this action. Little did the men of the 42nd Battalion know that in a meeting between the German commanders and the Kaiser the day before, the Kaiser had said, "We have nearly reached the limit of our powers of resistance. This war must be ended." The war didn't end. Far from it. Robert, as part of the 42nd Battalion, took part in the Battle of Mont Saint-Quentin. Now, General Monash knew how important this objective was, and he threw the Australians into battle. The Germans resisted fiercely and stubbornly, and leading the defence was the elite Prussian Guards, known as the Kaiser and Augusta Grenadier Guards. The Australians were forced back with heavy casualties, so the 42nd and other units were brought forward. Again, the fighting was brutal, but eventually the town was taken, but at a cost of 3,000 Australian casualties. The 42nd, 4 officers and 13 other ranks killed, 50 wounded and 2 missing. The battalion's strength was now horribly low, with many Australian battalions now having 300 to 400 men from a full strength of normally 1,170 men and officers. British Commander General Lord Rawlinson remarked that this feat by the Australian troops was the greatest of the war. Robert had another stunt left. Perhaps the most dangerous of all, the dreaded Hindenburg Line.
The Hindenburg Line is the last great line of defence the Germans have on the Western Front, and it's been impregnable since the beginning of 1917. To attack it front on is just impossible by 1916 standards of warfare. And so this is it. If you can break the Hindenburg Line, the Germans have got nothing new to try. There's nothing else. They could try and build another one, or we can just do this to Berlin.
General Monash was heavily involved in the planning, but he knew the battalions did not have enough men to sustain them. Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister, was insisting that the 6,000 originals, the 1914 men, should be sent home for 2 months' leave. 7 battalions had to be disbanded, and the 42nd was one of them. The men were furious. It seems like deserting our dead, some said. In any event, Monash rescinded the order. The Hindenburg Line still had to be taken, and on the 22nd of September, 2 divisions of American troops attacked the line, but the attack was unsuccessful. The 42nd was sent forward to the front line. This was bitter fighting against heavily fortified pillboxes. Heavy machine gun fire, vicious hand-to-hand fighting ensued as tunnels associated with the pillboxes had to be cleared. With grim determination, the companies of the 42nd gained their objective, and they held the ground until that following day. Then they were ordered to relieve the 44th Battalion. So the 11th Brigade, of which Robert was part, moved up to Boney Point and held the line until October the 2nd. Although the armistice was only 6 weeks away, Robert's war was over. He had survived. 544 men from the 42nd, including Fred, had not. Robert was among the 1,130 from the 42nd who were wounded. 151 had been decorated, but no military medal for Robert. He was awarded the 19 to 14 15 Star Medal, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal. He arrived back in Australia on the 30th of April 1919 and was discharged from the army. Frederick's body, together with some of his companions who were also killed in the battle, were taken to Bonnet Communal Extension Cemetery, where the battalion padre conducted a service at the grave. A temporary cross was erected over the grave with his full particulars on it. There are 75 Australians buried there. The cross of sacrifice, which stands tall in this small cemetery, was unveiled by the Prime Minister of Australia, Billy Hughes, in August of 1921. Fred's gravestone, erected sometime after armistice, simply says 682, Private F.C. Litzow, 42nd Battalion, Australian Infantry, 24th of April, 1918. A cross is below this inscription, but no other words appear. Perhaps for the family, the cross was enough.
They didn't need to go for their own purposes, but it was their duty to go for king, for country, for neighbours, for those who've gone before them. And their thought is never about themselves in this situation. And I think they're a real example to us of looking out for not just themselves, but the society they live in.
Robert returned to Ipswich and went to work at the North Ipswich Railway workshops. He never spoke about the war to his family. However, many of his workmates were returned servicemen, and what they talked about in private we'll never know. They understood the pain from unhealed wounds, the coughing from the effects of the gas, the grief of lost mates and brothers, the nightmares, the recurring sights that wouldn't go away even when you closed your eyes as tightly as you could, and the feeling that you just couldn't articulate that nothing in life would ever match those years. He marched every year at Anzac Day, here again at North Ipswich, and saw the marches thinning year after year. He married Evelyn Mary and had 2 children, a girl, Margaret Ruth, and a son, Frederick Robert. The older brother would never be forgotten. On the 23rd of April, 1923, a year after Fred and Robert's mother Mary died, there appeared a small memorial in the Queensland Times newspaper. It remembered Mary and Fred. It quoted from the old hymn, "Yes, we'll meet again in the morning, in the dawn of a fairer day, when the night of watching, waiting, with its darkness has passed away." The Great War seems a long time ago now. No eyewitnesses alive now to tell the story. Yet each Anzac Day we recite the words, lest we forget. And suddenly each of us are flooded with the images of those men in trenches. Unspeakable horrors that we cannot possibly understand become part of our thoughts, and deep and abiding sadness overwhelms us. Tears come, and men like Fred and Robert become, well, our boys for that fleeting moment as we realise the enormity of what they did. And we wonder if we could do the same. Then and only then do those words, lest we forget, become more than words, but an anthem hailing every generation, now and to come, to forever remember the bravery and the sacrifice of a generation lost. Yet that generation, to this very day, still shapes our history.